Recently, you may have seen on Twitter that West Virginia was rated as a Tier 5 Power 5 program in college football. That's right, folks. Tier 5. I had a little bit of a problem with that, but I thought I'd bring on the gentleman who made that list to explain his reasoning and maybe have a little friendly debate about it. So pull up a chair, sit back, relax, and we're going to have that discussion right after this word from our sponsor. Ladies and gentlemen, this episode is brought to you by Dutch Miller Automotive, where friends and family pricing means you get the best deal right up front on any new or pre-loved vehicle in stock every time. With brands like Chevrolet, Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, Ram, Kia, Hyundai, Ford, GMC, Buick, and Subaru, the Dutch Miller Automotive family is always growing and ready to put you in the car or truck you've been searching for. Check out our inventory across West Virginia at DutchMillerAuto.com or come in today to the home of friends and family pricing, only at a Dutch Miller Automotive store near you. What is up, college sports fans, Big 12 fans, fellow members of Mountaineer Nation? Welcome into another edition of Couz's Corner. Belly yourself up to the bar and let me pour you out a shot of top shelf college football content on tap at Couz's Corner today. We have a very special guest. I'm bringing on Kelley Ford from thelines.com, and he's going to talk about his ratings and why he has West Virginia rated last as a Tier 5 or rated last as a Power 5 program. So without further ado, Mr. Kelley Ford. Kelley, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Couz. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. And yeah, I'm looking forward to having a little bit of discussion here about West Virginia holistically and 2023.
Right. Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate you coming on, man. And real quick before we dig into the content, can you tell my viewers and listeners where they can find your work?
Yeah, for sure. So you can find me on Twitter or on X at KFordRatings. You can find my website, KFordRatings.com. I'm also doing some writing for thelines.com as well as their college football show, which is a podcast that has a video component. And I'm over at Saturday Glory as well, doing the Calculated Risk podcast. And then my buddy Zach and I have our own podcast, We Hate Your Team. We're in year 3 of that. That's part of the Variety Sport Network Collegiate. So yeah, I'm in a handful of different places, and I enjoy talking college football and getting stuff out there for people to talk about. I try to stay objective with the power ratings and resume rankings as much as possible. The whole reason for this appearance is I introduced a little bit of subjectivity into something, and it did not go well with Mountaineer Nation. So I know that's what we're here to talk about and get into a little bit more. So objectivity is what I'm going for. In this one instance, we went a little subjective and we saw what happened.
Right.
This is exactly why I don't usually do that, Couz. But hey, here we are,
I
and I'm
understand.
excited.
That's right. Hey, it's all in fun, man. Look, like I said, I took in my intro, I took a little exception to the ratings, but I did listen to the pod to try to get some context behind it. You guys didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about those bottom tiers for obvious reasons. I mean, your show can only last so long, so I get it. And your partner, I think, actually had West Virginia in Tier 4, so he's a little bit, I guess, a little bit more kind to us, I guess.
Yep.
But before we get into the discussion, I'm going to pull up the screen of the tweet you put out, kind of showing everything. Now, this is in alphabetical order, right? So it's not necessarily. It doesn't mean that West Virginia is at the bottom of Tier 5.
Correct. And it actually, so it's unfortunate what happened here from that standpoint. West Virginia, starting with the W, ends up at the bottom of Tier 5 alphabetically, where the reality is, Couz, is I was actually making these, again, with a lot of, I have my numbers, and I'll talk about those. They're actually kind to West Virginia, but I will explain why I kind of got to where I did. They were the cutoff team, the cutoff program. If I had one more team in Tier 4, it was going to be West Virginia. I know I've listed them here in alphabetical order. If I had listed them by how I actually had put it together, West Virginia was the number 1 team in Tier 5. And so in hindsight, I was this close to putting them into Tier 4. And had I done that, we would have avoided all of this, I think. But I wouldn't have been on the show with you. So maybe it was worth it. But yeah, West Virginia, right on that borderline. Zach did have them in Tier 4. I put them in Tier 5 because that's how they fell on that razor blade there. But yeah, it's very, very close. The margins are thin. 4 and 5 for the most part, even 3. There's a lot of interchangeability that I wouldn't argue one way or the other. But yes, that is where I got and how I got there.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not. I mean, most fans I saw, and I didn't see every interaction, but most of the ones I saw felt like we should have been in Tier 3, actually, versus Tier 5. Tier 4 probably would have been a little less upsetting to fans, I guess. But I guess when I was listening to the podcast, the first thing here's where I disagreed with it. When I was listening to the podcast, one of the first things you guys talked about was how you used history and brand history and that kind of thing when judging these teams. Well, and I look at this list and I'm thinking, okay, West Virginia is the 15th winningest program of all time. Okay, but yet you have teams, so their brand is recognizable. They have had success in the past. So I felt like there was a little bit of recency bias in here, maybe in your list. Can you explain why West Virginia is in Tier 5, and what am I missing?
Yeah, for sure. So with the history and recency is certainly playing a part here. Again, the way I was looking at this really, Couz, and maybe I didn't say it on the podcast, I'm looking at currently, how are these Power 5 job tiers, how would I tier them with a current look? That's why we have a tier 6. Cal,
Mhm.
Oregon State, Stanford, Washington State. We don't know
Right,
if they're going to be, quote, power teams moving forward in power
right.
conferences. That's why they're in a tier of their own. So it's very heavily considering the current landscape of college football. You mentioned that West Virginia is the 15th most winningest program in college football history. And I'm not necessarily looking at wins and losses. What I'm looking at is what is my power rating for these teams over the course of their history. West Virginia, still very good, comes in number 36. You'll see there are
Okay.
35. There are 35 teams in tier 1 through 3. So if I just went by that, they maybe would have been that first team in tier 4.
Okay.
But again, number 36 overall my power ratings. If we look at West Virginia's average KFord rating in the CFP era, so since 2014, West Virginia is actually number 30 nationally. So that's very good. And the new look Big 12, they're behind only Utah, Oklahoma State, TCU, Baylor, and Kansas State. West Virginia coming in right after Kansas State, before Iowa State, Arizona State, so on and so forth there. So
Okay.
they have performed in the CFP era pretty well, especially relative to the new look Big 12. What I am looking at, and what was ultimately the deciding factor for me in this, the longer you go back in history, that's really what I'm looking at for kind of your blue bloods. That's why Nebraska is in tier 2, because they
Right.
have significant history with national championships and sustained periods of excellence throughout college football history.
Mhm.
That's why they're there. The farther down I got the tier list, the less I was looking at the history, because in my mind, the history was not at that kind of exceptional level. Still very good history. You said 15th winningest. That's awesome. West Virginia fans should be very proud of that. I mean, I have nothing against West Virginia as a program or a team.
Right.
Actually, the Steve Slayton, Pat White teams, I mean, those are some of my favorite college football teams. Maybe I'm biased because I really like that 2007 season. But my
Right.
goodness, that West Virginia team that year, I don't have to tell you guys, if not for that game in the backyard brawl and I was excited that West Virginia might be in the BCS national championship game, and that year was so much fun. But the chaos struck one last time against West Virginia at the end, and it went the way it did. But I really like some of these West Virginia teams. I am looking at projecting forward. Where do I subjectively, and this is why I don't do this. This is why I stick to the power ratings and the resume rankings and do it objectively, because it's much less controversial that way. But subjectively, as I'm looking at the new look Big 12, and I'm trying to figure out what do I think the pecking order of this is going to be in
Mhm.
5-10 years. And maybe that's a fool's errand, because conferences are going to continue with realignment, and we don't even know what it's going to look like. But as things are currently standing with the 2024 membership, how does West Virginia project in that new look Big 12? You see teams I have like UCF and Houston, they're in tier 3. To me, that's because they are now in a power conference, whereas previously they were not, and they are located in talent-rich states with recruits. That's not
Right.
a knock on West Virginia high school football. That's very quick access to Ohio and Pennsylvania too, and we know there's good football there. It's not Florida and it's not Texas, right? Like those states consistently put out a lot of high quality college football or high school football players that play in college. So to me, that's why programs like that, and Texas Tech, again, West Virginia has been much better than Texas Tech in the last 10 years in the CFP era. But I have Texas Tech in tier 3 strictly because of they're in Texas. So a lot of this is driven by, yes, the last couple of years haven't been great, but it's more so the geography. And I know geography seems to matter less and less as we see conferences expanding across the
Mhm.
entire country. The new look Big 12 going to be in all 4 different time zones and all this. Like, I get it. But to me, the access to recruits and just how they stack up with some of those factors moving forward,
Right.
that's how I got West Virginia where I did. And again, I really wish I would have had them go the other way and just fall into tier 4. I didn't. I put them in tier 5. I'll own it. It is
Yeah,
what it
that's fair.
is. So that's kind of how I got there, though.
Right. Right. No, I get it. And I mean, I disagree with it, but I get it. But here's I guess here would be my question to you, based on looking at recruiting, geography, that kind of thing. Why would you I know you said there was some recency bias in there, but if you look at West Virginia's history, they've always had a disadvantage in recruiting, but yet they've always been able to overcome that for the most part, with the exception of a few seasons, right? These last 4, notably. When you look at recruiting in the Big 12, we've typically been middle of the pack. We've out recruited Baylor in a lot of years. We've out recruited Texas Tech in a lot of years. We've out recruited a lot of these Texas schools. When you look at recruiting rankings, so why do you think that won't continue?
West Virginia, for me, has a 4-year weighted KFord recruiting ranking. And so this is more about more than just collecting stars. It's about how are you filling team needs based on my team's talent composite and roster composition is currently number 36, which as that relates to the Big 12, you're behind TCU, Baylor, Oklahoma State, Texas Tech right there, Colorado right there, Iowa State right there, Arizona right there. There's a bunch grouped up there, but West Virginia is right there. They're trending down a little bit with regard to what it looked like a year ago at this time. So while I don't disagree that over the course of history, West Virginia has recruited at or above the level of some of these other teams, again, I'm projecting forward a trend I think might happen here as the conferences continue to realign and we continue to kind of figure out this NIL transfer portal. I mean, you name it, all the changes that are happening. I am just personally a little bit less in on West Virginia moving forward than they have been in recent history, which has been very good, especially within the Big 12 as we're considering these rankings. So that to me, as I'm trying to project forward, that's my educated guess. That's all it is, though. It's my opinion. It's formulated based on the things that I'm looking at. West Virginia could continue to do what they're doing, and that would be great. And they would end up certainly at tier 4, if not tier 3, as you said. My thinking is it might regress just a little bit slightly, and we'll see which one proves to be right. We won't know for a few years, so I guess easy to say now, but we'll think back and was Kelley right? Was Kelley wrong? I'll own it if I was wrong, and if I was right, I'm sure I won't hear about it from any West Virginia fans either way, but that's the way it goes. I get it. But yeah, number 36 and weighted 4-year, that's pretty good. And so, yes, you're right. I can't argue that. The data supports that. I just think moving forward, a downward trend slowly and not by big leaps and bounds, just slowly over time, I could see that going the other way. And that's not to say that teams in tier 5 can't have a phenomenal year. I mean, as I'm looking at the other teams that I had in tier 5, with that, just last year, Kansas went bowling. Illinois was in a position to make the Big Ten championship game late in the year. Wake Forest just a couple of years ago was in, the top 10 of the AP poll. All those are tier 5 teams for me, tier 5 programs in terms of Power 5 jobs. But you can still have success, and you can these tiers are fluid. But yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay. So it's basically based on mainly projections versus. So just explain a minute for maybe myself and my listeners, because when I was talking recruiting rankings, I'm looking at like 24/7 Sports, your national services that everybody talks about, right?
Yep.
What do you do differently when you rate your recruiting than maybe some of these other companies?
Yeah, for sure. So 24/7 Sports is certainly a bit, especially their composite. I really like their composite as they've aggregated a couple different services into that. That's heavily involved in my process. But to generate the preseason power ratings, there are 3 main components. And for anyone who's a fan of Bill Connolly and SP Plus, they'll sound very familiar because they're the same. It's your returning production, it's your recent recruiting, and it's your recent KFord ratings. But for recent recruiting specifically, I'm not just taking the 24/7 Sports or the ESPN 300 or whatever it is. I'm not just taking their ratings, their stars, and throwing them all in and saying, oh, well, West Virginia, they brought in 28 recruits and they averaged a 3.9 star. So like they're getting the X number of points based on that multiplication. What I'm looking at is, okay, West Virginia, where are their areas of need? If they're bringing in, let's say, I always use Ohio State as the example. Ohio State has, over the last few years, had an abundance of talent at wide receiver, and they bring in 5-star after 5-star, and those players go on to be first-round draft picks, and now they're having success in the NFL. It's just a factory of receivers. But Ohio's, because of that, they've built up some depth in that receiver room. You can't have 11 wide receivers on the field at a time. So if Ohio State were to bring in a 5-star receiver into this year's class, which they did, they're going to get credit for that, and that's a good thing. You want that. But it's not the same as if Ohio State brought in a 5-star offensive lineman, an area of more immediate and significant need. Like they could both be 5 stars and they could be ranked right next to each other in the composite. One could be ranked number 10, one could be ranked number 11 nationally. Like they could be right there. But that 5-star offensive lineman is going to have a bigger impact on the recruiting rankings of Ohio State because that's a bigger area of need. So I've identified these area of needs kind of across the board for all the teams. And now I'm looking at, as you're compiling these recruiting rankings, instead of just taking the raw numbers, it's how well, yes, they brought in all this talent. How well does that talent match up with the immediate needs and then also the long-term needs, of course, as you're filling out depth charts and planning for the future. But that's how I do it a little bit differently. So I'm not just taking, West Virginia was number 15 in the 24/7 sports composite. Well, maybe they were number 20 for me because the areas of need that they brought in didn't quite match up as well as the teams that were 16, 17 in the composite. They had identified their needs a little bit better, and now they've jumped ahead of West Virginia by a couple spots. I'm making up numbers there, but that's the general idea.
Now, do you factor in the transfer portal at all in your rankings?
Yes, and so that's been the transfer portal. Some people include that in recruiting. I've actually chosen to include that in returning production. So I know you see these things that are out there. Hey, these are their transfer class and their recruiting rankings and this. I just put it all in returning production. So you've got your own returning production, then you got your transfers. You got your transfers in and out. And so you have to have a scale or a multiplier for how do we scale the production of a transfer, right? So if somebody transfers to West Virginia from Marshall, I'm probably going to devalue their production at Marshall a little bit because production in the Sun Belt does not translate to equal production in the Big 12. Similarly, if someone transfers from West Virginia to Marshall, they're going to get a bump in their production because the production that they had at West Virginia is likely to have a greater impact at Marshall, given the difference in conference play and group of five versus power five and all that. It's the same thing with FCS to FBS. We have all these different scalars and multipliers to try to best account for it because returning production at one school does not equal returning production at another is the point. So yes, transfers are absolutely included. That's been one of the harder things to do in the summers here recently because of the increased usage of the transfer portal, the one-time free transfer now that every student athlete gets in football. I expect that to die down just a little bit. I think we're already starting to see maybe fewer people in the portal than previously or in more recent years. But once we cycle through, especially the extra year of COVID too, that's still a thing here for another year or two. Once we cycle through those things, like the COVID year eligibility, and then people are using their one-time free transfer at a much more kind of normalized rate because we're not getting this spike right at the beginning as it becomes available to all four classes all at one time. It'll be easier to track and we'll get better data and better predictability from it as we are able to backtest. But yes, it's a very important piece of college football right now. Ask any coach that's out there. I'm sure they'll tell you. Transfer portal is real. It's here to stay. And it is certainly something that is time-consuming to track, but it's included in returning production.
So I would imagine that probably hurt West Virginia on that list, right? Because we have lost so many guys to the transfer portal.
Yes, West Virginia at a net lost more than they gained in the transfer portal. But again, in terms of bringing back production and different things like that, there are other ways to compensate for that. But yes, as a net result in 2023, West Virginia experienced a negative, which is not uncommon for Power 5 schools to experience that, of course. But next year it could be very different. It's very much a yearly thing with an ebb and a flow, a roster management and coaching changes and all that stuff.
Right. Okay. And you mentioned NIL earlier. You look at the NIL landscape when you factor in these lists and different things that you create. I mean, based on everything we're hearing and reading about West Virginia's NIL program is actually doing really well, especially considering the landscape we're in as far as the size of our state, the number of donors we have. We have fewer donors than any team in the new Big 12. Okay, that's a fact. But Country Roads Trust, our collective, has gotten on several national lists as one of the top collectives in the country because of they've been able to find unique ways to generate money and things like that. Where did that fall into your decision making here?
Yeah, not heavily. Again, NIL. So NIL doesn't have a place in my power ratings or resume rankings. Of course, NIL implicitly or explicitly in some cases impacts recruiting, and that then of course transfers and otherwise that then makes its way in. But I don't have like a column set up for, hey, this NIL collective or that NIL collective, this many boosters. I don't do that like in the power ratings. And so in terms of subjectivity, I didn't really heavily weight NIL a whole lot. I think Zach did maybe a little bit more. Had I known West Virginia had this great collective and was outperforming other programs of comparable stature in terms of size, conference, whatever you want to call it, geography, Could that have been a tipping point into tier 4 too? Sure. I really didn't look a whole lot at NIL, to be completely honest. Everyone's still trying to figure that out. I actually work in college athletics full time. Like that's what my full time job
Oh,
is.
okay.
And so I work at a conference office. So we don't sponsor football in the league I work at. But we very much are tracking on all of the updates to NIL, all the state and national legislature that's being passed with trying to get Congress's help on some things too. So yeah, I am very much in tune with NIL. That does not make its way into the power ratings, at least explicitly, nor did it really become a factor here as I'm doing the tier things. Because let me just say too, final thing on that a little bit, or we keep going if you want, but final thought. This was an episode that Zach and I decided to do because we'd wanted to do it for a while. We hadn't gotten to it, and it was like, hey, you know what? Right before the season starts, let's just do this thing. We'll do it. We can still do episodes like this moving forward. Lesson learned. I'm not going to make a graphic of what we talked about and send it out to everybody, to the Twitter world, because of instances like this. West Virginia was not the only fan base that was upset. Trust me, there were teams and fan bases in tier 2 that thought they should have been tier 1. There were fan bases in tier 4 that thought they should have been tier 2. And then in West Virginia, of course, fan base upset with where they were too. Understandably, I get it. I told Zach, I said, we can do episodes like this in the future, kind of in future summers or off seasons or whatever. I'm not making a graphic ever again. Zach, you want to do that and put yours out there, go for it. I'm not doing this for me. Because again, this is why I stay away from the subjectivity stuff. And you're being great about it. And that's why I agreed to come on, because we've been following each other and I know how it was going to go. It's just, yeah, college football fans, man, say something about their team. You better be able to support it, back it up and all that. The numbers give me very solid ground to do that. This was really kind of I tied in the numbers a little bit to kind of frame my thinking, but it really was subjective, feel, all this. And so at that point, it's just my opinion, right? And what's your opinion? Why does it matter is what your fans are saying. I get it. I didn't say it did matter. I was just putting it out there because that's how I felt. And that's what Twitter is. So yeah, anyway, just wanted to say that too.
No, that's fine. Hey, but you know what? They say there's no such thing as bad publicity. So maybe all those clicks and reactions are not too bad, not a terrible thing for you.
I guess so, man.
Hopefully it got some people to watch your podcast or listen to your podcast rather. But yeah, I mean, I understand. And look, as a fan, I would be naive to sit here and tell you that our program is in a great spot. You know, we're having the worst 4-year stretch since the late 1970s. Okay, so before I was alive. Okay, this is the worst 4-year stretch of West Virginia football since I've been alive, and I'm getting ready to celebrate my 43rd birthday here in about a month. So it's not good. You know, we don't hide from that, but we just feel like, number one, we're very prideful and take a lot of pride in our team. This is our pro team here in West Virginia, as you know. You know, we love our team, and also as a state, we take a lot of flack as a state because of our poor economy and all the crap that you know all about it.
Yep.
Stereotypes and all that. So anytime somebody's and we our state is so tied into our university, man. It's almost like when you insult one, you insult the other to a degree. And so that's why our fan base is so passionate. But at the same time, that's also what makes college athletics so great, right?
Totally.
Because we are so passionate. We love our teams, and we will go to bat for them. But the one team I saw on the list that that really chapped my hind end for obvious reasons, I saw Virginia Tech in tier 3. And I'm thinking, how in the world is Virginia Tech, who we've had more wins than historically, they're down as well as a program. I mean, yeah, they're in Virginia, which might, it's a little better state for recruiting, but where was the rationale? Was that the rationale behind it is because of their geographic location primarily, or what are you thinking there?
It is so funny you said West or Virginia Tech here. And actually, Virginia Tech, because they start with a V, bottom of tier 3 alphabetically, but that actually is where I had them. That is so funny that we're talking about West Virginia and Virginia Tech. Virginia Tech was the last team that I put in tier 3 before tier 4. If I was going to put one more team in tier 4 the other way, it would have been Virginia Tech. So, like, oh my gosh, I knew we were talking West Virginia Tech. I didn't even know you were going to bring up Virginia Tech. It's so funny to me that that's where they landed. Probably not funny to your listeners as they're mad about it, but funny is not the right word. It's interesting to me that these are the two teams that I very easily could have put both of them in tier 4, and no one would ever known how I actually stacked them up against each other because it would have been listed alphabetically, and that's how I put it out there. So they were very, very close to both being in tier 4. As I look at Virginia Tech, 4-year KFord rating, the KFord rating in the college football playoff era, West Virginia's been better. I told you West Virginia's number 30, Virginia Tech's number 44. Virginia Tech from a national or from an all-time standpoint, very similar to West Virginia in terms of their national standing. So that's right there. Yes, there is a little bit better of a recruiting ground, if you will, being in Virginia. But the biggest thing, and I can't believe I didn't mention this earlier, the biggest thing that I'm looking at, I did mention it with West Virginia a little bit. How do they stack up within the new look Big 12? Also,
Right.
how does Virginia Tech stack up within the ACC?
Gotcha.
And this is a credit to the Big 12. Again, now I'm going subjective. In my opinion, the Big 12, even the new look Big 12, 2024 and beyond, they have better college football brands and better historical college football programs than the ACC. ACC for big brands in the ACC, Clemson has certainly come on in the last decade. And because of how much success they've had, 2 national championships in a couple of years there, I actually have them as a tier 1 program. I think my buddy Zach had them in tier 2, which I wouldn't argue that. It's been very recent history for them. Of course, they had one, back in the 80s, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
But Clemson, because of what they've done recently, they're number 3 in the CFP era by my KFordRatings. Like, they're there. Miami and Florida State are the 2 others that have had at certain points. Now, granted, Miami's history and Florida State's for that matter, both more, not nearly as long as some blue bloods in college football, which is maybe why they aren't considered blue bloods by some.
Right.
Miami and Florida State, to me, are, since basically, 1950, they're really good college football programs, and they've had extended periods of sustained success. If you look at the 1990s, and I know we're getting farther and farther away from the 90s, I get it, but they were the 2 preeminent programs, with Nebraska in there as well, having a good run too. But 80s, 90s, Miami, Florida State. I also didn't mention Bobby Bowden and Nick Saban, arguably the 2 greatest college football coaches of all time, having those ties to West Virginia. I think is a pretty cool thing about West Virginia. Another reason that I like West Virginia as a program in some instances. Right. I know people might not believe that given what I've said about them and where I put them, but I still, again, it's no hard feelings. I really don't feel that way about West Virginia any type of way. But outside of those 3 programs, Clemson, Miami, Florida State, like, who else are you looking at that you're going to say is a better brand or a better college football program than Virginia Tech? I mean, are you going to say Pitt? Sure, Pitt's had some success, in their history. North Carolina has had a team here or there, but I mean, outside of Mac Brown, not a whole lot. You're going to go, where else are you going to go? So, like, to me, that played a large part into me tiering these teams. Is what is your standing, both perception and reality, because those can be different things, but a lot of times perception is reality. What are your standings within that conference that you're currently playing in? If West Virginia was in the ACC, 1, I'd like it better from a geography standpoint, but 2, geography's out the window. I get it. I like geographical sense when it comes to conferences, but we've done away with that. I'll make my peace with it and move on. I would prefer them be in the ACC for that reason. But if West Virginia was in the ACC, I absolutely, let me look back at my tiers here too. I know you have them on the screen. I would have West Virginia potentially in tier 3. I mean, I'd put West Virginia in there with Pitt. I'd put them in there with Virginia Tech. Maybe this is the highlight of the whole show now that we've gone down this road. If West Virginia is in the ACC, I'd put them in tier 3 because they would be very similar to me to Virginia Tech, to Pitt.
Okay.
The reason that they're not, maybe they should have been in tier 4. The reason that they're not is because they're in the Big 12, which to me has better college football brands moving forward than the ACC does. So anyway,
that'd be harder.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's gonna be much more difficult for them in the Big 12, and that's not just from a brand standpoint. That's from a football standpoint.
Yeah,
the conference is better. The Big 12 is better on average than the ACC. That doesn't mean that necessarily the top teams like Clemson in any given year could be the best team in any of the 2 conferences moving forward. Right. But as a whole,
top to bottom,
the Big 12 is much better. The Big 12 doesn't have bad teams, at least as currently constructed. We might see, in Arizona or something like that moving forward. But in 2023, there's no bad team in the Big 12. It is the deepest conference, even if it lacks maybe the couple elite teams at the very top, although I think Texas will challenge that this year. We'll see. But yes, so maybe that's the takeaway. If West Virginia's in the ACC, they're a tier 3 team because they're in the tougher Big 12. They're tier 4, tier 5.
That's fair. And I appreciate, number one, the respect for the Big 12 because I am obviously a Big 12 guy as well. So we appreciate that. So basically, I'm going to kind of sum this up a little bit, and then we'll move on to the next topic, which is a 2023 preview. But the way I understand this here is you're projecting forward, and you actually think, and I'm, you actually in your head, in your opinion, USF, Cincinnati, Houston, BYU coming into the Big 12 might actually hurt West Virginia because those programs are on the rise and are in the case of Houston and UCF are in better recruiting locations. which could actually make it harder for West Virginia to win in the conference. Is that a
Without
fair assessment?
Without a doubt. That is 100% accurate. I think those programs coming into the Big 12 make the Big 12 more competitive, which makes it harder for everybody. And yes, especially in the case of UCF and Houston. I mean, Cincinnati, even to a certain extent. Now, Cincinnati is not that far from Morgantown. I get that. But now, if a recruit was in Ohio and they were evaluating offers and they thought, man, it'd be really fun to play in the Big 12. West Virginia made perfect sense. I'm going to go to West Virginia and it's going to be great. Or Pennsylvania. I mean, those are two, for being north of the Mason-Dixon, those are two really good high school football recruiting states. And if you want to play the Big 12 for whatever reason, or you wanted to be able to do this and do that, West Virginia was your option. Now Cincinnati's there. That's that's now a rival that you got to recruit against. And those are going to be some fun games, I think, long term. I get excited about maybe that rivalry, given the geographic proximity of those two teams in particular in the Big 12. I get excited about that. BYU, maybe not so much in terms of how they're playing into this part of the conversation, but BYU coming in the conference makes it more challenging too. So that is absolutely true. I agree with it 100%. And while it's good for the Big 12, it's maybe bad for West Virginia from a competitive equity standpoint, but it's bad for everyone in the Big 12 because these are good programs coming in that are in good places, good recruiting grounds, and have some history, recent history, especially in the case of UCF and Cincinnati, of their own. So yes, while it's good for the Big 12, it makes it harder for West Virginia. And that's why, too, all these SEC fans, I know this is not an SEC podcast. I don't want to make it that. I'm a Midwestern guy too. I'm from Indiana. So I don't want to make it about that, but they're all excited about Texas and Oklahoma, and they should be. Those are two great brands. I'm sad for the Big 12. To me, those programs belong in the Big 12 to me. But hey, it is what it is. I understand what happens. Again, I work in college athletics. I know how the money flows and how you follow it. But if you're a fan of a SEC program, and let me just that's not maybe in Alabama, in LSU, a Florida, a Texas A&M, and Auburn. If you are, in no particular order, if you are Mississippi State, Ole Miss, Missouri, Kentucky, Arkansas, South Carolina, Vanderbilt, you can maybe throw in a couple others too. I do not like that Texas and Oklahoma are coming in. All that's doing, your conference is already great. You already have some great programs. All you're doing, in my opinion, and it's backed by numbers in this case, you're just sliding farther down the pecking order on average within your conference.
Right.
So that's, in a way, that's kind of what West Virginia could experience. Now, West Virginia has a better 4-year or better CFP era KFord rating than the new 4 this year. You get Utah that's coming in that has a better one than West Virginia next year. But to me, I could see that happening to West Virginia potentially over the course of time. But yeah, I agree with your statement. It's 100% accurate. And again, if they're in the ACC, it's maybe a different story of the tiers. But yes, it's great for the Big 12. It's bad for the teams in the Big 12 and those fan bases because now it's just become harder to win those games. There's only so many conference wins to go around. One winner, one loser every game, and it's now become harder to get those wins.
Do you think us being a geographic outlier to a degree, it plays a role in that?
I do. Now, I will say, I thought it would be a bigger hindrance than it has been the last 10 years or so since you joined the Big 12, because now geography seemingly matters less and less. And now actually West Virginia is less of an outlier, if you will, now, since Cincinnati's come in and we've expanded the footprint so large now. It used to be West Virginia, they're the outlier and it's not even close. Now, yeah, sure, West Virginia's out there, but so is Cincinnati. BYU's up there, but so is Utah. Arizona State are out there, right? So now it's like, you totally UCF, they're way down there and they're kind of by themselves now. So maybe UCF's the biggest outlier now, if you will, just because there's no other team in a close geographic proximity to them. Who's the closest to them? Houston, maybe, in the new look Big 12. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. From a mileage perspective.
Yeah. So there's really no one else that close to them. So yes, I agree with that.
Okay. Reminder, this is Kelley Ford. He's over at thelines.com. You can find his work over there. You can find him on Twitter at KFordRatings, or I guess it's called X now. Find him on X at KFordRatings. You can find me at Couz at COUZ206 on X. Interact with us there. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, you can obviously see that on the screen. At the bottom of the screen, for those of you who are watching, I have the names of my channel members scrolling along the bottom. These are my club level members of the VIP, Couz Corner VIP Club. And then I have pub level members as well, which is the introductory level over at Couz's Corner. So if you guys want to become a member of that club, be sure to hit the join button below the video. If you're listening on podcast platforms, be sure to please give me a rating. I would appreciate that. A good rating, hopefully. But Kelley, where else, other than the stuff I mentioned, where else can people find you again?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, Couz. Overthelines.com, Saturday Glory with Calculated Risk, We Hate Your Team podcast as part of VSN Collegiate, but primarily it's Twitter, X, at KFordRatings, KFordRatings.com. That's where you can keep up with all the stuff. I'm just so excited for the 2023 college football season. I really am wishing West Virginia the best of luck. I'm excited to see what you guys got going on this year, and maybe you could be the TCU of last year and make a run unexpectedly to a conference championship game in the final year of the Big 12 as it's currently constructed. I'm really excited about the conference this year and the future of it. So it'll be fun, and I really appreciate you having me on, Couz, to talk more about this. And hopefully this helped answer some questions from some of the fans who were upset. But I get it. Everyone's going to have their opinion, and if you don't like mine, there's not much I can do about it other than try to say that's how I feel, and I've outlined why. So I appreciate it. This was so much fun, and we'll do it again soon, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again for coming on, Kelley. And those of you, don't forget to go check out all of Kelley's work. Follow him on X if you haven't yet. Kelley, once again, man, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks again for coming on.
Thanks, Couz.
Q Country Roads, everybody.